Forget his name, forget his past. Because, in essence, neither truly existed. This man was an absolute nobody, an anonymous phantom who emerged from the darkest depths of Russia's time of troubles. He was a sham, an impostor who dared to impersonate another impostor, False Dmitry I, who had already been killed in Moscow. Think about it. To be a fake of a fake. This wasn't mere audacity. It was a brazen mockery of the entire system, of faith, of the very concept of legitimacy. And most shockingly, this nobody, this vagrant from nowhere, managed to rally tens of thousands of people under his banners. He created not just an army, but an entire shadow state, the Tushino Camp, which became a real, bleeding wound on the body of Russia. He plundered lands, issued decrees, collected tribute, and dispensed justice and retribution, all while possessing nothing but a borrowed, already used legend. He was called the Tushino Thief, and this nickname was not merely an insult, but an accurate description of his essence. A bandit king who, on the wave of chaos, attempted to seize an entire country for himself. This is not a story of a hero, but of a parasite that latched onto the weakened body of the state and nearly brought it to its knees. His audacity and ability to manipulate the despair of the masses. That's what makes his figure so unique and truly terrifying. He demonstrated how easily a great state could be brought to its knees by a man with nothing but an insatiable, animalistic hunger for power and a talent for deception. To understand how such a nothing could become such a destructive force, one must look into the dark corners of society that spawn such phenomena. We have already glimpsed the sinister shadow cast by the Tushino Thief over a tormented Rus. But who was this man before his name, or rather someone else's name, became a symbol of despair and destruction? History has not preserved his true name, and this is no accident. He was a nobody, a man born into the lowest strata of society, in conditions where every day was a struggle for survival, and human life was worth less than a broken kopeck. His childhood was no idol, but a school of survival forged in the crucible of abject poverty and cruelty. Imagine a world where hunger was a constant companion, and any transgression was met with merciless beatings. A world where a child learned from an early age, the strong take from the weak, and justice is merely a tool for those who wield the stick. Even if he wasn't a serf, he certainly wasn't among those who could expect mercy from fate. His hands, likely from a young age, knew hard labor. His back, blows, and his mind, humiliation. It's no surprise that he didn't seek salvation in prayer, but rather secretly observed how order crumbled, how old masters were replaced by new, even more insatiable ones. This experience forged in him a deep conviction. Rules exist only for those incapable of breaking them. He saw how people broke, how backs bent, how eyes dimmed, and he saw how those with enough audacity and unscrupulousness could rise from rags to riches, perhaps for a short time, but brightly enough to blind those yearning for change. His point of no return wasn't a single event, but a slow, agonizing realization of his own insignificance in this cruel world. He watched as the first False Dmitry, an upstart pretending to be a Tsarevich, managed to stir up the entire country. He saw how thousands of desperate people clung to any hope, any legend. And he concluded, if a dead Tsarevich could rule, why couldn't he, alive and full of insatiable energy? The time of troubles wasn't just a crisis, it was social chaos, grinding down destinies. Nobles were ruined, peasants fled, cities burned. Old social ladders were broken, but new ones emerged, bloody and merciless. Anyone who could wield a weapon, gather a crowd, and promise the impossible could become a temporary king in this anarchy. The risks were colossal. Death by starvation, by bullet, by torture. But the reward, power, wealth, the illusion of greatness, was equally intoxicating. In this environment where the strongest, or rather the cunningest and most ruthless, survived, the Tushino Thief received his true education. He learned to say what people wanted to hear, to promise what they desperately believed in, and to use their blind faith to achieve his own, entirely earthly goals. His subsequent actions demonstrate that he wasn't just a random adventurer. He was a product of his era, its quintessence, ruthless, cynical, and incredibly resilient. This resilience, multiplied by an insatiable hunger for power, allowed him not just to survive, but to impose his will on tens of thousands of people, turning them into instruments of his own ascent. How exactly he pulled off his most audacious schemes and what fatal mistakes he made at the peak of his power, that's another story. His emergence wasn't a sudden flash, but a slowly building storm that swept over a tormented Russia. The man history would remember as the Tushino Thief didn't just dream of power. He built it from lies and despair. His ambitions knew no bounds, and every step was a calculated, cynical scheme with one goal: to swallow the Tsardom of Muscovy whole. His first, truly grand design wasn't merely to capture the capital, but to create an alternative capital that would intercept all political, economic, and even spiritual flows of the Muscovite Tsardom. The thief had no intention of storming Moscow head-on, when he could drain its lifeblood by establishing a shadow state that would intercept all supply routes, all human and financial resources. The plan was simple, but devilishly effective. Establish himself in close proximity to the first throne, Moscow, declare himself the true sovereign, and begin receiving envoys and subjects, creating an illusion of absolute legitimacy and the inevitability of his rule. He was convinced that Moscow, exhausted by internal strife, would collapse on its own, provided a sufficiently powerful counterweight was established. By the spring of 1608, Tushino, a small village 12 versts, approximately 8 miles, from Moscow, had been transformed into a true fortress city. Ramparts, deep moats, palisades, artillery batteries, all of this sprang up with incredible speed. Within this new capital was its own royal court, its own prikazy, departments, mirroring those in Moscow, and even its own patriarch Filaret, whom the Tushino thief ostentatiously abducted from Rostov. This was not a temporary camp, but a fully functional miniature state, with its own bureaucracy, tax system, and judiciary. He dispatched charters, collected tribute from surrounding lands, essentially plundering them under the guise of legitimate levies, and dispensed justice, punishing and pardoning. His court was filled with self-proclaimed boyars, princes, and Polish nobility, szlachta, each receiving their share in this chaos, and more importantly, feeling part of a new, rising order. Thousands of people, Cossacks, petty nobles, peasants, runaway serfs, flocked to him, drawn by promises of freedom, land, and of course the opportunity to plunder with impunity. The Tushino thief directed this process with indomitable energy, like a conductor orchestrating destruction. Every new adherent, every convoy laden with plundered gold and provisions, seemed only to reinforce his pathological conviction of his invincibility. But the most crucial, utterly unpredictable turn that cemented this masquerade occurred when Marina Mnishek arrived in Tushino, the very same widow of False Dmitry I, who, it seemed, should have exposed him and put an end to this farce. Instead, under pressure from Polish magnates, and in a desperate attempt to regain some power and wealth, she recognized him as her miraculously saved husband. This scene, played out before thousands of stunned witnesses, was the height of cynicism and became the cornerstone of his mystification. Mnishek, yesterday the widow of a Russian Tsar, now lay with an impostor, transforming deception into reality. It was shocking, repulsive, and alas, incredibly convincing for many who yearned for a miracle. The consequences were colossal. This recognition lent the Tushino thief the missing legitimacy in the eyes of many doubters. The Tushino camp transformed from a mere gathering of bandits into a real threat, dividing the country into two warring factions, where every city had to choose whom to pledge allegiance to. Dozens of cities and districts, from Yaroslavl to Vologda, from Kostroma to Vladimir, swore allegiance to him. The total devastation of the central Russian lands began. His gangs, feeling complete impunity and protected by the Tsar's name, plundered, burned, and killed, gathering resources to sustain this monstrous scheme. The thief was at the peak of his power, reveling in the illusion of authority, convinced that the world lay at his feet, and no one could stop him. Blinded by this success, the Tushino thief made a decision that he believed would finally break the spirit of Moscow's resistance and bring him untold riches: to capture the Trinity Lavra of St. Sergius. This was not merely a fortress, but the heart of Russian spirituality, a repository of immense wealth and a powerful symbol of defiance against the Moscow government. The capture of the Lavra would mean not only vast spoils, but also a devastating blow to the morale of Tsar Vasily Shuisky and his supporters. The thief planned a lightning assault, counting on overwhelming numerical superiority and his conviction that the monks would be unable to offer serious resistance. His calculation was simple: break their will, then take everything. In the autumn of 1608, the Tushino Thief's multi-thousand-strong army, a motley horde of Poles, Lithuanians, Don and Zaporozhian Cossacks, and of course Russian rebels, approached the Lavra's walls. Thus began a siege that would last not weeks or even months, but a full 18 months, a year and a half of continuous hell. Hundreds of cannons, from light artillery pieces to heavy siege guns, pounded the walls, attempting to breach them. The Tushino forces launched assault after assault, attempting to take the monastery by attrition, by undermining its defenses, and by fire. They spared neither themselves nor their opponents, throwing thousands of lives into the fray. The thief personally directed operations, demanding the impossible from his commanders, demonstrating his boundless confidence in an imminent victory and his cold-blooded cruelty. He saw the Lavra as the final, vexing bastion that needed to be crushed to assert his complete and absolute rule over Rus. But the Tushino thief, intoxicated by previous successes and a sense of impunity, underestimated something not measured by soldiers or cannons: the spirit of the defenders. A handful of monks, a small number of streltsy, musketeers, guards, and nobles, under the command of Prince Dolgorukov and Boyar Golokvastov, offered fierce, heroic resistance. They repelled assaults, launched audacious sallies, and built countermines, blowing up enemy galleries. Every day of the siege became hell for the Tushino forces, while the Lavra stood as an impregnable rock, a symbol of unyielding will. Losses were immense. Morale in the Tushino camp plummeted, and the monks, despite hunger and disease, continued to pray and fight. The siege of the Trinity Lavra of St. Sergius became the Tushino thief's fatal mistake, a turning point that exposed his strategic blindness. Instead of a quick victory, he got a bloody meat grinder that exhausted his troops, undermined his authority, and showed the world this Tsar was far from omnipotent. Over 18 months of siege, the Tushino camp began to crack at the seams. Failures at the Lavra, constant internal strife between Polish mercenaries and Russian Cossacks, and the atrocities committed by the Poles, who plundered even their own territories. All this led to yesterday's supporters turning away from the Tushino thief. His sense of impunity, born from easy victories and a blinding thirst for power, resulted in an inability to accurately assess the situation. He continued to believe in his destiny, but the ground beneath his feet was already burning, and his tsardom was, in reality, turning to ashes. What began as one man's audacious spectacle had transformed into a bloody tragedy for an entire country. The Tushino thief, whose power was built on lies, violence, and others' ambitions, began to lose control over the chaos he himself had created. His army, cobbled together from disparate bandits and adventurers, could not withstand prolonged strain. The Tushino thief was not merely an impostor. He became a puppet in the hands of those who yearned to tear Russia apart, and simultaneously a magnet for all who felt disenfranchised or craved chaos. Behind him stood an entire coalition of predators. His primary patrons, without a doubt, were the Polish-Lithuanian magnates. Princes Adam Wisniewicki, Roman Ruzhinsky, Jan Pyotr Sapieha. These names resonate like a death knell for Rus. They harbored no illusions about his identity. For them, he was merely a tool, a puppet on strings, allowing them to plunder Russian lands, seize fortresses, and negotiate for new territories. They invested money, men, and military expertise in him, receiving in return the right to endless levies and the accumulation of their own political influence. Every captured city, every ravaged village, it all meant profit in their pockets. Joining them were also Russian defectors, boyars and nobles who had lost influence at Vasily Shuisky's court or were simply seeking personal gain. Princes Dmitry Trubetskoy and Ivan Zarutsky, Mikhail Saltykov. These figures, once serving Moscow, now pledged allegiance to the Tushino Tsar, legitimizing him in the eyes of a segment of the population. They received positions, lands, and the right to dispense justice and retribution, satisfying their ambitions at the expense of a ravaged country. A distinct force was comprised of the Don and Zaporozhian Cossacks, for whom the time of troubles became a golden age. They saw in the thief a chance for boundless freedom, plunder, and enrichment. Tens of thousands of armed, undisciplined men, ready to follow anyone who promised spoils, became the striking force of the Tushino Camp. All these disparate but avaricious forces found in False Dmitry I a convenient banner under which to realize their darkest aspirations. But there was also one who, with all his might, tried to halt this insane carnival of anarchy. His chief antagonist was the legitimate, though not universally recognized, Moscow Tsar Vasily Shuisky. His path to the throne had been thorny and marred by bloody events. A boyar from an ancient Suzdal lineage, he came to power after the assassination of the first False Dmitry, relying on a conspiracy and the support of a segment of the Moscow nobility. However, his ascension did not bring stability. Step by step, he attempted to consolidate his power, but his authority was constantly undermined. Shuisky was not a charismatic leader, but rather an experienced schemer, facing a challenge of unprecedented scale. He tried to combat the Tushino Thief by all available means, dispatching charters appealing for loyalty, raising troops, and attempting to negotiate with Polish King Sigismund III. The conflict between Moscow and Tushino was not merely a war between two armies. It was a struggle for legitimacy, for the right to be the sole center of power. Shuisky, confined to Moscow, was forced to defend himself. His resources dwindled, and his supporters defected to the thief's side. Shuisky's desperate attempts, including enlisting Swedish mercenaries under the command of Jacob De la Gardie, only exacerbated the situation, opening doors for new interveners and further complicating an already tangled political map. This agreement, concluded in Vyborg in 1609, brought new problems for Russia, but at the time Shuisky saw it as his only chance to preserve the remnants of his power. He was willing to do anything to destroy the Tushino Thief, understanding that the existence of two czars in the country would inevitably lead to complete collapse. The siege of the Trinity Lavra of St. Sergius, which dragged on for 18 months, became an indicator not only of the defenders' resilience, but also of the Tushino Camp's growing weakness. While the thief's forces were being depleted under the monastery's walls, new plans were slowly but surely maturing in Moscow, and Vasily Shuisky, despite all his shortcomings, was preparing for a final decisive strike. While Vasily Shuisky, exhausted by the struggle, sought alliances and prepared for a decisive strike, his adversary, the Tushino Thief, found himself caught in a trap of his own making. 18 months of besieging the Trinity Lavra of St. Sergius had drained the Tushino Camp of its last vitality. Instead of a swift victory and fabled riches, the thief faced grueling battles, desertion, and growing discontent. Polish mercenaries, weary of the protracted campaign and the absence of promised spoils, began to grumble. Their loyalty had always been measured in gold and plunder, and now these sources were drying up. Prince Roman Ruzhinsky, one of the thief's primary Polish patrons, realized the futility of remaining in Tushino. He, like other magnates, saw that the False Dmitry II project had run its course. Polish confederates pursuing their own interests began to massively abandon the Tushino camp, transferring their service to Polish King Sigismund III, who by then had openly entered the war against Moscow. Tushino emptied, like a deserted ghost town. On December 18, 1609, the thief, abandoned by his main allies, could no longer remain in the emptying camp. He decided to flee. This was not a strategic maneuver but a panicked retreat, dictated by fear and the realization of complete collapse. Leaving Tushino, which would soon be completely dispersed by the forces of Mikhail Skopin-Shuisky, the thief moved south to Kaluga. He hoped to gather new forces there, but every step he took indicated a loss of his former influence. He was no longer a focal point, but merely a fugitive seeking refuge. In Kaluga, he attempted to recreate the semblance of his court, but his position was precarious. Shadows gathered around him. Discontent festered among his closest circle. Prince Pyotr Urusov, a Tatar Murza whose people had suffered from the thief's tyranny, harbored a plan for revenge. Urusov, formerly remaining in the retinue, awaited the opportune moment. And that moment arrived. On December 11, 1610, the thief went out hunting in the vicinity of Kaluga. He likely believed that amidst the snow-covered fields and forests he was safe, that here, far from intrigues and battles, he could relax. But the enemy was close, very close. Urusov and his accomplices caught up with him. The scene was swift and brutal. The thief, caught off guard, had no time to resist. Urusov, following his plan, shot him in the chest with a pistol. Then, to leave no doubt about his demise and rule out any possible miraculous salvation, the thief's body was decapitated. His head, as in the case of the first False Dmitry, became a trophy, proof of the impostor's definitive death. It was sent to Moscow to dispel any lingering rumors and hopes of his return. The death of the Tushino thief did not bring immediate stability. On the contrary, it only exacerbated the chaos, making the time of troubles even more unpredictable. His departure left a vacuum that new contenders for power and new interveners immediately began to fill, whose actions would lead to even more catastrophic consequences for the Russian state. His demise was not an end, but merely a new turn in the endless cycle of deception and betrayal that consumed Rus'. The story of the Tushino thief is not just a page in the Russian time of troubles. It is a grim and instructive tale of how emptiness can become a gravitational center for tens of thousands of people, and how a phantom can inflict more harm than a real enemy. The main lesson of his short but destructive career lies in the paradoxical power of non-existence. The Tushino thief was a nobody, but it was precisely this nullity that allowed him to become an ideal vessel for others' ambitions, a banner for those who craved power, land, or simply the opportunity to plunder. He was not a great commander or a wise ruler. He was merely a reflection of collective despair and cynical calculation. The universal mechanism of deception he so masterfully employed lay in exploiting society's deep yearning for order, for a true czar, even if that czar was merely a perceived savior. He didn't make promises he couldn't keep, because his promises were merely echoes of others' hopes. The people who swore allegiance to him didn't so much believe in his divine resurrection as they clung to a convenient version of reality that justified their own actions. Whether it was the pursuit of gain, hatred for Shuisky, or simply the search for some anchor in a world collapsing before their eyes. It was not only a mass deception, but also a mass self-deception, where everyone played their part in a grandiose spectacle of the absurd. His legacy is not the triumph of an adventurer, but a testament to how easily the collective consciousness can be manipulated when truth becomes too inconvenient. The Tushino thief proved that in times of chaos and uncertainty, a symbol, even an empty and false one, can gain colossal power over minds. He was the embodiment of that fragile line where history ceases to be fact and becomes myth, where reality gives way to a desired illusion. His story is a timeless narrative, repeating itself again and again across different eras and cultures. It is a chronicle of how, amidst division and hopelessness, when traditional institutions lose authority, phantoms emerge, capable of leading armies, destroying states, and rewriting destinies. And the main, most uncomfortable question the Tushino thief leaves behind is, what compels people to cling so desperately to an illusion, even when it leads them to inevitable destruction? And to what extent is a society experiencing crisis willing to accept any, even the most absurd lie,